In the hallowed, silent archives of academia, some knowledge is buried for a reason. Dr. Leo Thorne, a brilliant linguistics student, believed he was on the cusp of a discovery that would define his career. Instead, he found a single, forbidden word in the journal of a madman, a linguistic parasite described with a dire warning. Driven by intellectual pride, he gave it voice in the silence of the library. Now, an entity made of sound has installed itself in his mind, and it's beginning to deconstruct his reality, one word, one memory, one thought at a time. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The air in the University Library's Special Collections Archive was thick with the hallowed quiet of the dead. It smelled of decaying paper and binding glue, a scent Leo Thorne had come to associate with discovery. For 6 weeks, he had been living in these tombs of forgotten knowledge, his world shrinking to the cramped space of a single oak table, piled high with the private journals of the late Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was a specter in the world of linguistics, a genius who had mapped the family trees of 3 proto-languages before he was 30, only to vanish into recluse obscurity amidst whispers of a catastrophic mental breakdown. His newly acquired papers were Leo's ticket. A thesis on Finch's lost work would not just earn him his doctorate, it would make his name. Leo's passion wasn't just for language, but for its bones, its very architecture. He loved the clicks of Khoisan, the guttural stops of forgotten Semitic dialects, the elegant phonetic structures that formed the building blocks of human thought. He traced the faded ink of Finch's elegant script, marveling at the older entries, brilliant, lucid, and groundbreaking. But as he progressed through the years, the script began to change. It grew tight, frantic, the margins filled with panicked scribbles, diagrams that looked less like linguistic trees and more like circuit diagrams for a machine of madness. It was in the final, leather-bound volume that he found it. Tucked between pages of paranoid rants about auditory predators and mimetic contagions, Leo discovered a section dedicated to a single, isolated word. Finch hadn't translated it. He claimed it had no translation. It was not a label for something, but something in and of itself. "It is not of human origin," Finch wrote, his handwriting a barely controlled tremor. "I reconstructed it from the negative space between Proto-Indo-European and Uralic roots. It is an anomaly, a phonetic impossibility that should not exist. It is a self-propagating structure, a cognitive parasite." Below the description was the word itself, represented not by letters, but by a series of strange, non-standard phonetic symbols. There was a glottal stop combined with a lateral fricative, followed by an unvoiced velar trill and a series of vowel markers that seemed to contradict each other. It looked like a car crash of phonetics. Finch's notes came with a stark, underlined warning, circled multiple times in angry red ink. Rule number 1, never give it voice. To speak it is to invite it. To hear it is to host it. It is not a word. It is an installation process. Leo leaned back, a skeptical smile playing on his lips. This was it, the final, tragic proof of Finch's descent. A cognitive parasite? It was the beautifully articulate rambling of a brilliant mind collapsing under its own weight. Yet, he couldn't look away. His linguist's mind was captivated not by the warning, but by the challenge. He looked at the impossible cluster of symbols. Was it even pronounceable by a human larynx? The sheer academic audacity of it was intoxicating. He was alone. The archive was a maze of towering shelves, and he was tucked away in a soundproofed study carrel designed for researchers working with delicate audio recordings. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the climate control and the frantic beating of his own heart. Just a sound, he told himself, the ravings of a dead man. His academic hubris was a powerful, driving force. He saw the phonetic notation as a mountain to be climbed. He spent the next hour breaking it down, tracing the symbols with his finger, mouthing the individual components silently. He used Finch's own phonetic guides from earlier, saner, journals to understand the notations for tongue placement, airflow, and vocal cord vibration. It was a puzzle. Finally, he felt he had it. He took a deep breath, the thrill of the forbidden overriding his rational mind. He leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper in the crushing silence. His first attempt was a choked, sputtering cough. The sounds were alien, refusing to connect. They felt sharp and wrong in his mouth, like chewing on broken glass. He tried again, focusing on the transition between the guttural stop and the hissing fricative. This time a sound emerged. It was a harsh, guttural, multi-syllabic noise, a sequence of clicks, hisses, and the low, vibrating hum. Gthar su Thorne. The name is a poor approximation. The actual sound was far more complex, containing phonemes that had no place in any language he knew. It didn't echo in the soundproofed room, but it felt like it did. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a fraction of a second too long, a greasy, resonant stain in the pristine silence, before it vanished. And then, nothing. The world did not end. No demon appeared, the lights didn't flicker. There was only the quiet hum of the archives and the lingering, coppery taste of adrenaline in his throat. He felt a sudden profound wave of foolishness. He had just whispered nonsense syllables in a soundproofed room because a dead man told him not to. He shook his head, a small self-deprecating laugh escaping his lips. He'd clearly been spending too much time alone. Packing his bag, he slid Finch's final journal back into its archival box, the strange symbols still burned into his short-term memory. He left the library, stepping out into the cool evening air, completely unaware that he had just opened a door, and he had no idea what he had just invited to step through. The next morning, the world was exactly as Leo had left it. The sun cut sharp lines across the floor of his cluttered apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The incident in the archive felt distant, a silly, embarrassing secret. He dismissed it as a product of late-night research and too much caffeine, a final, absurd homage to the mad genius of Alistair Finch. He sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through news articles on his tablet, his thesis notes spread around him. The first glitch was small enough to be a ghost. "Could you pass me the... he said to himself, reaching for a utensil to stir his coffee. The word was right there, on the tip of his tongue. Spoon. A simple, monosyllabic word he'd used thousands of times. But as he opened his mouth, a different word came out. Fork. He paused, looking at the spoon in his hand. That was odd. A simple slip of the tongue. He was tired. His mind was overloaded with Proto-Indo-European verb conjugations. It meant nothing. He stirred his coffee and took a sip. Later that day, while cross-referencing a textbook on historical linguistics, another anomaly occurred. He read a sentence, "The collapse of the Akkadian Empire led to the fragmentation of the linguistic landscape." He underlined it, made a note, and looked away to check his phone. When his eyes returned to the page a few seconds later, the sentence had changed. The fall of the Akkadian Empire led to the splintering of the linguistic landscape. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Had he misread it the first time? Collapse and fall, fragmentation and splintering. They were near synonyms. It was entirely plausible, even likely, that he had simply substituted the words in his own mind. Deniable. Utterly deniable. But a cold knot of unease began to form in his stomach. That evening, the auditory anomalies began. He was on the phone with his sister, listening to her talk about her new job. In the slight pauses between her words, he heard it.
a faint, gossamer-thin hiss, like static on a bad connection. It was almost imperceptible, but it had a texture, a faint resonance that was eerily reminiscent of the sibilant, frictional part of the unword he had spoken. "Can you hear that?" he interrupted her. "That hissing sound." "What hissing sound?" she asked, her voice perfectly clear. "Are you okay, Leo? You sound distracted." He apologized and ended the call, his heart thudding. He stood in the middle of his silent apartment, straining his ears. Nothing. But a few minutes later, as his refrigerator kicked on, the familiar hum sounded wrong. It was subtly off pitch, as if the frequency had been shifted by a few hertz, just enough to be unsettling. Over the next 2 days, the glitches multiplied. He'd ask for a towel and say blanket. He'd type an email and find that the word meeting had been replaced with gathering. He would hear phantom echoes at the end of stranger sentences on the bus, that same static-laced hiss. For anyone else, this would be a sign of stress, fatigue, or the prelude to a migraine. But Leo wasn't anyone else. He was a linguist. His entire life was built on recognizing patterns in language, and he was beginning to recognize a terrifying pattern in the errors. They weren't random. The substitutions were always semantic, never nonsensical. House for home, car for automobile, sad for unhappy. It was as if a linguistic rule was being subtly, systematically rewritten in his brain. The phonetic shifts were consistent too. Certain vowel sounds were flattening. The crisp T at the end of a word would sometimes come out as a softer D. He sat at his desk, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. The skepticism that had been his armor was cracking, flecking away to reveal the raw terror beneath. He opened a fresh document on his laptop and began to type, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Title: Personal Lexical Corruption Analysis, Day 3. He started documenting everything, every slip of the tongue, every misread word, every auditory hallucination. He recorded himself speaking simple sentences and played them back, analyzing the waveforms on his computer, searching for acoustic artifacts. And he found them. Tiny, almost invisible spikes in the audio data, hidden within his own speech that mirrored the frequency of the hiss he kept hearing. He was a scientist observing a phenomenon, but the laboratory was his own mind, and the specimen under the microscope was his own sanity. The feeling of foolishness he'd had in the archive was gone, replaced by a cold, rising dread. Finch wasn't mad. Finch was a cartographer who had drawn a map of the abyss, and Leo, in his arrogance, had decided to go for a walk. He hadn't just spoken a word. He had run a program, and now it was beginning to execute. The fourth day marked the beginning of the true unraveling. The subtle semantic drift became a landslide. Common words, once readily available, now hid from him, forcing him into bizarre, convoluted substitutions. He wanted to ask the barista at the campus coffee shop for a large black coffee, but the words evaporated as he reached the counter. A wave of panic washed over him. He stood there mute as the student behind him in line signed impatiently. "I'll have," Leo stammered, his mind a frantic blank space where the word coffee should have been. "A hot, dark liquid from the roasted bean, the biggest one you have." The barista gave him a strange look, but complied. Leo fled with his drink, his face burning with shame and fear. The simple act of communication, the bedrock of his existence, was becoming a minefield. His weekly thesis meeting with his advisor, Dr. Anya Sharma, was a catastrophe. Anya was sharp, supportive, and firmly grounded in conventional linguistic theory. She represented everything stable and rational in his academic life. So, the progress on the Finch journals. Find anything to challenge the official narrative of his breakdown? Leo opened his mouth to explain his initial findings, to talk about the brilliance of the early work. But the thoughts in his head and the words that emerged from his mouth were becoming strangers to one another. The early volumes, Leo began, the words feeling thick and clumsy. They exhibit a, a luminosity of intellect. But the final container of pages, it sings a different sound. Anya's brow furrowed. Sings a different sound? Leo, are you being poetic? No, he insisted, frustration mounting. The symbolic representations, they shift. The grammar, it decays. He describes a thing of language, a self-eating sentence. He was trying to say a mimetic parasite, but the words were gone, replaced by this clumsy, almost childlike description. Anya's expression shifted from academic curiosity to genuine concern. She saw the panic in his eyes, the sweat on his brow. Leo, you look exhausted. Maybe you're spending too much time with Finch's later work. It's known to be disturbing. Perhaps you should take a few days off. Get some rest. He wanted to scream, to tell her that it wasn't about rest, that a sound was unwriting his mind. But how could he say that without sounding exactly like the madman whose journals he was studying? He just nodded, defeated, and left her office, the chasm between his thoughts and his speech growing wider with every passing moment. The corruption began to bleed into the written word. Staring at his laptop screen, he watched in horror as letters seemed to shimmer and momentarily rearrange themselves. The word language on a web page flickered for a split second, becoming a jumble of nonsense, Gelenga, before snapping back into place. Was he seeing it, or was his brain misinterpreting the data before it even reached his consciousness? The distinction no longer seemed to matter. That night, hunched over his notes, a horrifying theory began to crystallize. The glossolalia, as he had started calling the unword, wasn't a blunt instrument. It wasn't possessing him. It was a decompiler, a virus designed for the operating system of the human mind, language. It had installed itself in his brain's language centers, the Broca and Wernicke areas, and was now actively and systematically deconstructing his native tongue. It was replacing established linguistic rules, phonetic norms, and semantic links with its own alien, incomprehensible logic. And the confusion, the cognitive dissonance, the sheer mental panic it created in him, that was its nourishment. It was feeding on the breakdown of his reality. With trembling hands, he opened Finch's final journal again. This time, he wasn't reading it with academic skepticism. He was reading it like a patient comparing his charts to a textbook. He found the entries from the weeks following Finch's own discovery. They were a perfect, terrifying mirror of his own experience. Day 5. Words are becoming slippery. I called for my wife, Eleanor, but her name felt foreign in my mouth. I used a synonym for cup, and she looked at me as though I were a stranger. Day 12. Auditory artifacts are constant now. A low hum behind every sound. The entity's processing, I think. It is digesting me. Day 21. The syntax is failing. I cannot form a complex sentence. My thoughts are islands. I try to build a bridge of words between them, but the bridge collapses. The parasite is winning. Leo slammed the journal shut, a strangled sob caught in his throat. The final, horrifying truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Alistair Finch wasn't mad when he wrote the warning. The warning was the last same thing he ever wrote. The unword made him mad. And now, it was doing the same to him.
The world grew quieter as Leo's ability to interact with it disintegrated. He stopped answering his phone. He let emails go unread. The thought of simple conversation filled him with a paralyzing dread. His apartment became his fortress and his prison, a silent space where the true horror could finally make itself known. In the absence of external noise, the internal sound grew louder. It wasn't a sound in his ears. It was deeper, more fundamental. It was a hum, a persistent internal resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones, in the fluid of his skull. It was a cognitive echo of the unword, a low-frequency thrum that was always there, just beneath the surface of his hearing. It was the sound of the parasite's processing, the sound of his own mind being methodically taken apart. The hum intensified when he struggled to communicate. If he tried to write an email, concentrating on finding the right words, the resonance would build to a low roar, a pressure inside his head that made it impossible to think. It was a feedback loop. The harder he tried to use language, the more aggressively the parasite fought back, and the more it fed on his struggle. Silence became his only refuge, but even in silence, the hum was a constant, terrifying companion. He began to isolate himself completely. He ordered groceries online, leaving a note on the door for the delivery person to just leave the bags. He communicated with the landlord via curt, pre-written text messages. He spent hours composing, checking and rechecking every word for corruption before hitting send. His friends, at first concerned, grew frustrated. Voicemails went unanswered. "Leo, man, it's Mark. Call me back. We were supposed to grab a beer. You've fallen off the face of the earth or what?" "Leo, it's Sarah. I'm getting worried. Please just text me back so I know you're okay." He listened to their messages, a lonely ghost in his own life. The hum in his head, a mocking counterpoint to their concerned voices. He couldn't explain. He couldn't risk speaking. Dr. Sharma, however, was not so easily deterred. After a week of silence, a series of urgent emails appeared in his inbox. "Leo, urgent, check in. Leo, I'm coming by your apartment if I don't hear from you." Panic seized him. He couldn't let her see him like this. He had to explain, but he couldn't use his voice. It took him nearly 6 hours to compose a reply. He wrote it in a simple text editor, fighting for every single word, battling the hum that pulsed in his skull. He wrote and rewrote each sentence, checking it against a dictionary, fighting the urge to use the strange circumlocutory phrases that now came so naturally. Subject: apologies, research update and health. Dr. Sharma, I apologize for my silence. I have not been well. My research into Finch's work has led to an unexpected complication. I believe Finch did not suffer a standard psychological breakdown. I believe he discovered a mimetic pathogen, a linguistic construct that, when vocalized, infects the host's cognitive linguistic functions. I believe I have been infected. I'm experiencing significant linguistic degradation, semantic substitution, phonetic decay, and grammatical corruption consistent with his late-stage journal entries. I am isolating myself to prevent potential transmission. I know how this sounds. I am documenting my symptoms rigorously. This is not psychosis. It is a structured, observable phenomenon. Leo. He hit send, his entire body trembling with exhaustion. The reply came less than an hour later. Her alarm was palpable, even in text. Subject: REA, apologies, research update and health. Leo, thank you for responding. I am extremely concerned. The symptoms you're describing, aphasia, disorganized thought and speech,
are hallmarks of serious neurological events, like a stroke or a severe psychological break brought on by stress. The idea of a mimetic pathogen is a delusion, Leo. It's Finch's madness getting into your head. You need to see a doctor immediately. I have the number for the university's head of neuropsychology, Dr. Evans. I can call him for you. We can go to the emergency room. Please, let me help you. This is not something you can handle alone. Leo stared at the email, the hum in his head swelling. She didn't understand. She couldn't. To the rational world, his truth was a symptom of insanity. He was completely and utterly alone with the sound and the silence. He was a man drowning, and everyone on the shore was calmly advising him that water wasn't real.
Dr. Sharma's email planted a new and far more virulent seed of terror in Leo's mind. I am isolating myself to prevent potential transmission. He had written the words as a theoretical precaution, but now the possibility became a monstrous, all-consuming fear. If the unword was a virus triggered by being spoken, could he spread it? Was every word he uttered now a potential vector? The memory of whispering it in the sound-proofed carol felt like a memory of licking a diseased sample in a biohazard lab. His self-imposed isolation was no longer just about protecting himself. It was about protecting everyone else. He became terrified of speaking aloud, even to himself. The hum in his head was his own private damnation, but the thought of inflicting it on someone else, on Anya, on his sister, on some random stranger, was an unbearable horror. He started communicating exclusively through typing. His apartment, once filled with the murmur of news, radio, or podcast, fell completely silent. He taped over his laptop's microphone. He unplugged his phone, leaving it dark and inert on the kitchen counter. The silence was his quarantine. The parasite, however, seemed to have other ideas. Driven by a morbid need for data, Leo had recorded his last disastrous phone call with his sister. He wanted to analyze his own speech degradation. Now, he plugged his headphones in, wincing as he listened to his own stilted, failing attempts at conversation. And then he heard it. In a burst of what he had assumed was line static right after he asked about the hissing sound, he detected something else. He isolated the half-second of audio, running it through forensic filtering software, stripping away the noise, amplifying the signal. His blood ran cold. Hidden deep within the static, faint but unmistakable, was a distorted echo. It was his own voice, whispering a slivered, fragmented piece of the unword. He hadn't done it consciously. He would have remembered. It was the parasite. The entity residing in his speech centers had attempted to piggyback on the electronic signal, to push its own code through the phone line. It was trying to replicate. His paranoia exploded. Was it sentient? Was it actively trying to spread? Every digital communication became a source of terror. Could it embed itself in the audio data of a voice message, in the binary code of an email? The machine was not just deconstructing him, it was looking for a new host. This new, terrifying revelation sent him diving back into Finch's journals with a desperate urgency. He was no longer just looking for a diagnosis, he was looking for a cure. He skipped past the mad ramblings and focused on the frantic final pages, searching for any hint of a solution. And he found it, scattered across fragmented notes and nearly illegible diagrams. Finch had realized the same thing. He had become terrified of speaking to his wife, of infecting her with his linguistic affliction. He, too, had searched for an answer. A parasite of structure must have a structural weakness. It is not a being, but an algorithm. Algorithms can be crashed. Finch's research was desperate and wild. He was looking for a counterphoneme, a linguistic antidote. He theorized about creating cognitive firewalls through meditative silence. He explored the concept of semantic saturation, the phenomenon where a word loses its meaning through rapid repetition.
wondering if he could starve the parasite by repeating a single word until it was nothing but a meaningless sound, denying the entity its nourishment of cognitive dissonance. The notes were a mess of brilliant, desperate ideas. Finch had tried reciting palindromes, speaking in invented languages, even attempting to overwrite the parasite by learning a new language from scratch. But each attempt was documented with a subsequent note of failure. The saturation is temporary, the meaning returns, and the hum with it. My invented grammar is too weak. It builds on the ruins of my old language. The parasite co-opts the new structures. The journal entries grew more and more incoherent, the scientific inquiry dissolving into a soup of symbols and panicked loops. Finch's research was a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly off a cliff. He had searched for a cure, a way to install the parasite, but his notes trailed off into the very madness he had tried to fight, leaving Leo with a handful of failed experiments and the chilling certainty that he was walking the exact same path.
The world began to fray at the edges. Leo had always understood, on an intellectual level, that human beings do not perceive reality directly. We perceive it through the filter of language. Language gives the world structure, meaning, and permanence. It separates a chair from the abstract concept of wood and fabric and legs. It links the cause of a dropped glass with the effect of its shattering. Now, as his internal language system was being deconstructed, his perception of the world began to deconstruct with it. It started in fleeting moments. He would look at the lamp on his desk, and for a terrifying, vertiginous second, the concept of lamp would vanish. He wasn't looking at a lamp. He was looking at a meaningless assembly of plastic, metal, and glass, a shape without purpose or name. The object permanence he had taken for granted his entire life began to waver. He would leave a book on the table, turn away, and when he looked back, he would feel a genuine gut-wrenching surprise to see it still there, as if its continued existence without his observation was a miracle. Cause and effect felt disconnected. He'd knock a pen off his desk and the clatter of it hitting the floor would seem to happen a moment too late, an auditory event untethered from the physical one. His reality, once a solid, reliable construct, was being overwritten by the parasite's alien, non-linguistic logic, a logic of pure, unstructured sensory input. The entity, the glossolalia, was no longer just a passive decompiler. As it erased his own logic, it began to assert its own. This communication wasn't verbal, it was behavioral. He would find himself unconsciously engaging in strange symbolic rituals. He'd wake up in the morning to find the forks and knives in his kitchen drawer arranged in complex spiral patterns that mirrored some of Finch's most frantic notes. His hands, when idle, seemed to have a will of their own. He was sitting at his computer, trying to focus, when he looked down and realized his left hand was tapping out a rhythm on the desk. It was a complex, syncopated beat, and he recognized it with a jolt of horror. It was the syllabic stress pattern of the unword. The most terrifying manifestation came when he tried to type. He would be composing a simple sentence in his research log, something like, "The decay is accelerating," but as he typed, his fingers would betray him. He'd look at the screen and see, "The decay is accelerating." The parasite's name, or at least the phonetic symbols for it, was beginning to insert itself directly into his writing, a digital signature from the virus corrupting his system. It was no longer just erasing him, it was writing its own code into the empty spaces. A new kind of clock was ticking. Before he had feared going mad, now he feared far worse, erasure. Soon he might lose the cognitive and linguistic ability to even try to fight back. The part of his mind that could recognize the problem, that could research a solution, that could even form the concept of I that wanted to survive was being systematically dismantled. He was in a race against his own mind's dissolution.
He had to find Finch's cure, the cognitive crash, before there was nothing left of Leo Thorne but a shell of a man humming to himself in a silent room, arranging silverware in patterns he didn't understand, his mind filled with nothing but the endless internal resonance of the unword. The logic of his world was failing. He had to find a new one, a weaponized one, before the silence consumed him entirely. The clue was not in Finch's primary journal, but in a footnote within a footnote of one of his earlier published works, a treatise on phonological decay in ancient Anatolian languages. It was a cryptic reference. Cf. Archive Box 7, Item 42, The Paradox of the Cretan. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. Leo hadn't been back to the library since the day he'd spoken the word. The thought of returning to that place filled him with dread, but he was out of time. Disguising his gaunt appearance with a baseball cap and keeping his head bound, he navigated the familiar halls, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The hum in his head was a low, angry roar, as if the parasite sensed where he was, where it had been born into his consciousness. Item 42 wasn't a document. It was a small, reel-to-reel audio tape, labeled simply, Final Attempt, AF. Back in the sterile prison of his apartment, Leo threaded the fragile tape onto an old player he'd bought online. He was surrounded by a chaotic whirlwind of his notes and Finch's journals, his own descent mapped out on paper around him. He pressed play. Finch's voice, raspy and thin, crackled through the speakers. There was no cure word. There was no single, magical counterphoneme. It was, as Finch had theorized, a process, a linguistic ritual, a way to force a fatal crash in the parasite's algorithm. It is a structure built on the rules of language, Finch's recorded voice whispered, the sound warped by the magnetic tape. It feeds on the predictable paradoxes of human confusion, but it cannot withstand a true, weaponized paradox. It cannot compute a system actively and intentionally at war with itself. You must introduce a contradiction it cannot resolve. You must force a cognitive schism. The tape then laid out the horrifying, brilliant, and insane procedure. Leo took a deep breath, the hum in his mind swelling to a deafening crescendo. He placed headphones over his ears, a microphone in front of his mouth. He had Finch's recording of a simple sentence, "This statement is a lie," ready to play. The ritual began. He started by speaking the alphabet slowly and clearly. As he spoke, he typed the alphabet backwards on his keyboard. A, Z, B, Y, C, X. His brain screamed in protest. The dissonance was immediate and agonizing. The hum in his head spiked, and the edges of his vision began to swim. Next, he hit play on Finch's recording, feeding the Cretan paradox, "This statement is a lie," into his left ear. Simultaneously, through the microphone, he began to read a different sentence aloud from a piece of paper, a sentence he had carefully constructed. "The voice I am hearing is telling the truth." The two contradictory inputs slammed into his consciousness. One piece of logic asserted its own falsehood, while another asserted the truth of the first. His mind became a battleground for an impossible equation. The parasite fought back. It fought back with everything it had. The internal hum became a physical force, a skull-shattering roar that vibrated through his teeth. His apartment, his fortress, began to warp. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor tilting like the deck of a ship in a storm. His vision flooded with strobing, meaningless symbols, the raw phonetic code of the unword. He saw glimpses of Finch's frantic face, of the silent library archive, of his own hands typing the parasitic name. He felt his own sense of self, his identity as Leo Thorne, begin to dissolve. The pronoun I started to feel thin, transparent. What was I but a collection of memories and linguistic habits? The very things the parasite had been devouring. He was on the brink of total ego death, of becoming nothing but the vessel for the roaring sound. But in the storm, Finch's final instruction from the tape echoed. Hold to the core, the anchor, the one concept language cannot fully describe but always points to. Hold to you. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. He shut his eyes, ignoring the hallucinatory chaos, and focused everything he had left on a single, wordless concept, his own existence. He wasn't a name. He wasn't a linguist. He was the consciousness experiencing the storm. He was the anchor. He pushed forward with the final step of the ritual. While still listening to the paradox and speaking his contradictory sentence, he began to whisper the unword itself. He spoke its name, the harsh, guttural syllables, but he did it backwards. He forced the installation code to run in reverse, while his brain was simultaneously tearing itself apart with logic bombs. He was introducing a syntax error in the core of the virus itself. The effect was instantaneous. The roar in his head peaked, becoming a single, pure, white-hot sound. The visual hallucinations flared into a blinding light. He felt a tearing sensation, as if his mind, his very soul, was being ripped in two. He screamed, a raw, wordless sound of pure agony. And then it stopped.
Silence. Not the muffled quiet of his apartment, but a profound, absolute silence in his own mind. The hum was gone. The oppressive, constant resonance that had been his companion for weeks had vanished as if it had never been there. The silence was so complete, so pure, that it was a sound in itself. Leo opened his eyes. The walls of his apartment were stable. The floor was solid beneath his feet. He looked at the chair across the room, and his mind supplied the word effortlessly, instantly, without a flicker of doubt. Chair. It was a simple, beautiful, perfect word. The relief was so immense it was physically painful. A wave of exhaustion, deep in tidal, crashed over him and he collapsed to the floor, his body limp, his mind a silent, peaceful void. He lay there for a long time, just breathing, reveling in the glorious, uncomplicated silence. The aftermath was not without its cost. When he finally tried to speak, to say, "It's over," no words came. His mouth opened, but his brain couldn't form the connection, couldn't send the right signals. The ritual, the cognitive crash he had initiated, had not just wiped out the parasite, it had temporarily shattered his own linguistic pathways. He was suffering from a self-induced temporary aphasia. Recovery was slow. He had to rebuild his connection to language, word by word, like a stroke victim. He pointed at objects and thought their names. He read children's books aloud to himself in the quiet of his apartment. The words came back, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. The experience had left a scar, a deep and permanent respect for the fragile structures that hold a mind together. He eventually submitted a formal report to Dr. Sharma. He framed it not as a supernatural event, but as a case study in self-induced mimetic cognitive disorder, complete with his meticulous documentation of the symptoms and his paradoxical intervention therapy. Anya, shocked by his physical transformation, but relieved to see him lucid again, accepted it as a remarkable but bizarre case of psychological recovery. Perhaps she cautiously believed him, or perhaps it was easier to file it under the brilliant, eccentric legacy of Alastair Finch. The academic world was safe again. Months later, Leo was recovered.
He abandoned his thesis on Finch, switching his focus to neurolinguistics and the potential dangers of theoretical phonetic reconstruction. He was giving a guest lecture to a small group of graduate students. He was confident, articulate, the words flowing easily. He said, "The very basis of language is its ability to create new meaning through the combinatorial potential of a finite set of phonemes." He paused. In the complex structure of the word combinatorial, for the briefest, most fleeting of instants, he felt it. Not a hum, not a sound, but the ghost of a structure. A faint, familiar echo of the unword's impossible phonetics latent within the very building blocks of the word he had just spoken. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. He felt a phantom chill, a memory of the abyss. He cleared his throat, subtly correcting his phrasing. "The potential for combination," he continued, his voice steady despite the sudden tremor in his soul. The parasite was gone. He had silenced it, but he knew with the certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his life, it couldn't be. Its components, its broken pieces were latent in all language, like dormant viral code woven into the DNA of human thought. It was always there, waiting for the right combination of sounds, the right sequence, the right academic curiosity, the right unsuspecting voice to be given life again. He finished his lecture. The applause was a distant, meaningless noise. As he walked away from the podium, one thought, one rule echoed in the profound and precious silence of his mind. Rule number 1. Never say its name out loud.